You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 344, recorded on January 24th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line this week, as always, is my co-host, Rachel in Idaho. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
And also co-hosting with us this week from New York City is Kelley. Hi, Kelley.
Hi, Bill.
So a few weeks ago on the show, we talked about one of the three pivotal labor strikes of 1934, in that case, the Toledo Autolite strike. That was episode 338. That happened simultaneously with today's topic. Last week, of course, we talked about the 2002 West Coast Ports lockout of the Longshoremen Union in episode 342. Today's episode is about the 1934 West Coast waterfront strike, which led to the unionization of all the West Coast ports. And we hope to next week hit the remainder of the trifecta from 1934. Now, first things first, let's get back into the conditions that led to this strike, just as we talked about the conditions that enabled the Toledo Autolite strike, because many of the same factors were working in all three of these strikes, not just specific to today's, although there were obviously some specific conditions. And the other thing is that this one's a really interesting strike, I think, because as we've been alluding to on recent episodes, the longshoremen tend to have a reputation as being a militant union that had a lot more radicalism and got great results. And that's definitely true, as we'll see today. But it is not always the case, as we'll see in this strike, at this sort of turning point in their history, that the leadership was in agreement. So, a theme of the show frequently is the difference between leadership and rank and file on strategy, tactics, and, when to make a deal versus when to keep fighting. So, Rachel, talk to me about the specific conditions that led to the strike that eventually became known as the 1934 West Coast Longshoremen's Strike.
So, first off, there were company unions. So they were really weak and they were associated with the company. Also, these companies were open shop. Employees did not have to pay dues. And also there was a blue book system. So it was actually recorded, your union membership was recorded in this blue book, and it was recorded that you paid dues and so forth. And so it was just like a really weak system that didn't give a lot of power to the workers. So many groups did try to organize these longshoremen, sailors, and fishermen. The IWW, through the Marine Transport Workers Union, tried, and also the Maritime Workers Industrial Union, also known as the MWIU. But they just didn't make very much headway. However, passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, which protected collective bargaining rights of unions, led to a massive increase of union membership in the International Longshoremen's Association, or the ILA, which previously was trying to organize but just wasn't making very much headway. So these emboldened union members tore up their company union membership books and started refusing to pay dues to the company unions. And they were starting to demand a coast-wide contract, a union-run hiring hall instead of a company-run hiring hall, and also an industry-wide waterfront federation. So they were starting to agitate for that. ILA leadership negotiated a weak, quote-unquote, gentleman's agreement, but the rank-and-file members rejected it. There was an Australian born sailor who was pretty radical. He was a longshoreman in the U.S. Harry Bridges kind of led that charge to refuse this gentleman's agreement that just didn't give the members what they wanted.
Now, as we'll see, this strike that unfolds in eventually a number of cities, but I think starting in a few specific locations, it ends up being one of the sort of closest examples that the U.S. gets to not only a general strike in some places, but more broadly just a genuinely industrial sectoral union. As you said, one of the goals was to get contracts, or one of the goals of some people anyway, was to get contracts and a single union for not only the whole industry in a specific port, but also all of the ports along the entire West Coast, which of course makes it much stronger, not just in the strength of its membership, but also in the fact that the companies can't just bring in other people from other ports if there's a dispute in one specific port, and they can't reroute cargo to a different port if there's a dispute in one specific port. And there was also some less success in terms of trying to get the entire waterfront industry unionized, as we'll talk about. That's, again, goes back to that craft unionism versus industrial unionism debate that we've talked about on the show before. Should the union be for a specific occupation, or should it be for all of the occupations within an entire industry? In this case, all the different professions that worked on the waterfront versus just some of the professions and occupations that worked on the waterfront. Now, Kelley, this is one of the sort of the biggest strikes in American history in terms of its scope and size. Could you give us some of the specific details that you found on the 1934 strike on the West Coast ports?
Absolutely. And like so many of the topics and events we cover on this podcast, I found myself thinking, I can't believe I haven't heard of this before. This was a really huge event in American history and in American labor. The strike lasted 83 days, and at its height, it included nearly 35,000 maritime workers and other unions who then had sort of sympathy strikes by refusing to handle cargo that passed through these ports that were striking. And this event is really credited as a reason for labor resurgence on the West Coast. The International Longshoremen's Association went from 1,300 workers in 1926 to over 12,000 workers in 1935, with this 1934 event really being a huge turning point for the union. Like we'll talk about throughout this podcast, it did turn violent at a few points, and it claimed the lives of 8 or 9, depending on where you look, people on both sides of the event. It really engulfed the city of San Francisco in particular, in what some refer to as an insurrection or revolt against the government, with 130,000 workers out on strike. And there were a number of strikes in Portland and Seattle as well. In the port of Seattle, only one ship managed to leave the harbor during the whole 83-day strike, just going to show how successful this was. And that's despite the fact that the police chief in Seattle at one point said it was a state of emergency and mobilized police to open the port. So as you can imagine, or as Rachel and Bill have alluded to, this event was the result of decades of organizing maritime workers and the longshoremen and the folks that they worked with. An example of a less successful strike had come in 1916, when there had also been a 3-month strike of longshoremen, but the gains were quickly erased because, like Bill and Rachel said, the employers just started to pit the ports against each other. It would bring in workers from other ports. So this organization up and down the West Coast was really key to the success of this event and the continued success of the ILA after 1934.
Again, as you said, to emphasize, I mean, we're talking about decades of attempts to organize unions, not really going anywhere for most of that time. Some unsuccessful strikes that we'll maybe come back to on another episode. But then this key change, which I want to emphasize again, Rachel already mentioned it, but it's something that we talked a lot about on our Toledo Autolite strike episode, is that one of the big differences is this sudden surge in membership and people's willingness to participate in unions with the stamp of approval from the federal government, from the FDR administration. This is something that various left-leaning or progressive authors in American history have identified as sort of a key turning point that also unlocked a lot of reactionary politics, although we've certainly talked about the World War I era and early 1920s reactionary anti-union sentiments and so forth before. But this having the FDR administration come in and pass the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933, the year before, having that propaganda that the unions could say, and I mean that in the best possible way, the unions coming in and saying the president wants you to join a union. This is where the organizing combines with the huge surge in membership to actually achieve something here. as you said, Kelley, we're talking about tens of thousands of maritime workers, which means, the longshoremen, the stevedores, et cetera, the people that work on the actual docks, as well as the sailors, because you need them to also operate the ships or else they're not going anywhere either. And then if you add in all those sympathy strikes, and especially the general strike that broke out in San Francisco, we're talking about 100,000 plus workers in just one city, and a lot of other sympathetic workers in other cities as well. So certainly, as you said, Kelley, a very significant episode in American labor history that a lot of people probably have not heard about if they don't know a whole lot about labor history specifically, or make that their focus. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of the chain of events that led to the actual outbreak?
Sure. So this ILA was forming. There was organizing up and down the West Coast of these maritime workers and longshoremen. And the ILA decided that they wanted a coast-wide contract in order to fight that ability of employers to sort of pit ports against each other. They also wanted wage increases. They wanted to end unfair practices, including shape up, which meant that the boss sort of got to pick the workers for the day and the other people didn't get paid, as well as speed up, which meant that workers were required to do more and more work, including sometimes unsafe work, without any increase in pay. Like Rachel said, they really wanted these hiring halls to be run by unions and not bosses. In good old employer fashion, the employers refused to bargain with the ILA. They didn't recognize it. And so the longshoremen on May 9th, 1934, hung up their hooks, quote unquote, and began the strike. By mid-June, an agreement was offered to the ILA, but then on June 14th, temperatures continued to rise as Seattle's new police chief declared a state of emergency and mobilized police to open the port. And on June 16th, all but one of ILA's local chapters rejected the agreement, so the strike continued. Tensions, as you can imagine, continued to rise at this point. Cities and governments are becoming more and more committed to opening these ports, even if it means violence, and workers are more and more committed to their cause now that they've seen an agreement that didn't meet their expectations. In Seattle, the worst confrontation came on the evening of June 30th at the Standard Oil storage tank farm on Point Wells. Striking workers were in the area and came to the area in order to prevent scabs who were trying to break up the strike, but they were met with armed guards at the fence, and gunfire ensued. Shelby Daffron, one of the strike leaders, fell mortally wounded, and he died the next day. Similarly, there was a lot of violence in San Francisco, including a day which came to be referred to as Bloody Thursday, which was 2 days after the riot began in San Francisco on July 3rd. 2 strikers were dead and many were wounded when police cleared the port area by force. And then just a few days later, on July 6th in Seattle, more than 6,000 workers came out to the funeral of Shelby Daffron, who is the strike leader who was killed in the standoff there in Seattle. So at this point, their public opinion is starting to shift in favor of the unions. But at the same time, the media is beginning to paint the unions as communists. Some of the leaders are arrested as having ties to communism. And this violence and this mistrust between all sides just continues to heat up over the course of the summer. President Roosevelt and the NLRB did support in negotiating an end to the strike. An agreement was reached on July 23rd and work resumed on July 31st. The final settlement came in October, and in that final settlement, the ILA was largely successful. They got a wage increase to 95 cents an hour. They had been hoping for $1 an hour, but they got pretty close. They had negotiated a 30-hour work week, which meant 6-hour work days. They got hiring halls, which were jointly operated by the union. and the company, but the union was able to sort of pick the leader of these hiring halls, which was a step in the right direction. And they also got recognition as a single coast-wide union, and then which allowed them to continue to operate as the ILA for decades to come. So 83 days, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of disruption to the port activity, but in the end, largely what is considered a successful strike for the ILA.
Rachel, could you talk a little bit more specifically about the general strike component in San Francisco?
Yeah. So it started July 16th, and it was prompted by the killings of Howard Sperry and Nicholas Bordeaux, who were the two people killed in Embarcadero area of San Francisco. The strike lasted 4 days. It involved about 150,000 workers in the Bay Area. The killings of Howard Sperry and Nicholas Bordeaux just really galvanized the workers in that area. Many small businesses closed, posting signs in support of the strike. Movie theaters and nightclubs were closed, and even non-union truck drivers joined the action. They did allow food deliveries to be made, obviously, just to keep people fed and keep food supplies going. But there really was a lot of pro-union sentiment at that time, and just a lot of sympathy for the workers after they were shot out by the police. Violence by the police really marked throughout the whole endurance of the strike. In the first week alone, police killed Dick Parker in San Pedro in the Port of Los Angeles. And like Kelley mentioned, Bloody Thursday was on July 5th when police shot into the crowd. On July 17th, in the midst of the general strike, the California National Guard, as well as the San Francisco PD, actually assisted vigilante raids of union headquarters. An ACLU lawyer was kidnapped and beaten, and 13 radicals in San Jose were actually kidnapped and turned over to the sheriff in an adjoining county. And during this time, a police spokesperson suggested that, quote, maybe the communists staged the raids themselves for publicity. So there was a lot of state violence happening to keep like the wheels of commerce turning. And the employers actually had agents riding out with the police during their raids. So it was just capital and the state were kind of working hand in hand to enact this violence against the workers.
Now, what would you say was the aftermath of the strike? We've heard some of the specific details from Kelley, but how do we sort of sum up what was achieved here? Again, this is generally considered to be, as with the Autolite strike in Toledo, not only one of the most important strikes in Depression-era American history, but also a successful strike, which is not always true for a lot of the strikes we talk about on this show.
Yeah. So the ILA just continued to cement their power. Like Kelley said, they basically got to control hiring on the docks because they were put in charge of the hiring halls. They also knew how to use quote unquote quickie strikes to continue to get safer working conditions and better pay. And over the years, they actually disassociated with the International Longshoremen's Association, and they are now what today is known as the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And they are still known as kind of one of the most militant and most active unions to this day. So they really still continue to wield a lot of power on the West Coast, and they are not afraid to stop work when they see something that needs to be confronted.
Now, before I get into my next questions, just as a reminder to our listeners, we'll have the links and notes up at arsenalfordemocracy.com with this episode, as we do for each episode. But one thing that I was thinking, or one thing that I was noticing as I was reading through our notes and some of the reading materials on this 1934 West Coast ports strike, was that there seemed to be a bit of a disparity here between leadership and rank and file, which, in some of the strikes that we've talked about in the past, the leadership tried to negotiate an end to things, and the rank and file wasn't willing to go along with it, and the rank and file were the ones that overplayed their hand, and the strike ended in disaster. But in some cases, we've certainly seen, and this seems to be one of them, cases where the leadership being a little bit more conservative and skittish, sometimes underplaying the hand that rank and file actually holds. Obviously, in this case, having control of the commerce flowing in and out of these major American ports is a pretty significant choke point to control. And, we talked about how that continues to be the case to present day with the 2002 lockout, which was prompted in part by accusations that the union was engaging in a deliberate work slowdown, which they, of course, said they were not. They said that they were working carefully to make sure that there weren't any further deaths that year, as there had been a number of deaths, but that they weren't deliberately or illegally doing a slowdown or something. What should be our takeaway here in terms of the disparity between leadership and rank and file on this particular strike?
Well, I think the rank and file really were able to force the hand of the leadership, starting at the very beginning when there was that gentleman's agreement with the employers, and the rank and file decided to go against them. So I think I think we're going to see this a lot more in the coming weeks and months. I know we're kind of seeing a battle between the Chicago Teachers Union happening, where the rank and file is really concerned about their working conditions and the safety of reopening schools. And I think, as we've seen, the rank and file really has a lot of power in forcing the leadership's hands. And I think that's going to happen more and more in the coming weeks and months, as workers are butting up against those unsafe working conditions. And employers aren't really addressing those needs.
Now, as you said at the time, this is the pre-radical era, at least from a leadership perspective, certainly, of the longshoremen's union on the West Coast. And initially, the ILA was sort of coming out of the East, I guess, the eastern ports in this time period. And they were sort of newer on the scene. Again, we had those kind of weak company unions working directly, directly affiliated to the companies that they were coming in and trying to replace. So in that sense, they were more radical than that, certainly, but that's a pretty low bar to clear. And there were a lot of accusations that the leadership of the ILA was corrupt, and that these, bargains they would strike were not the best deals that could be reached. And that was certainly proven, I think, by this particular strike. But I mean, how do we think about that? I guess there's also the discussions, that we've alluded to in the past of the role of, especially in the post-war period, the role of organized crime in some of these trade unions, in terms of like that. That's not about helping get their members things. It's about making sure that there's some level of control that the employers in capital can organize, at least indirectly, to get sort of these side deals.
Yeah, I think something that really needs to be emphasized is that the union is only as strong as its members are active. So if members are just paying their dues and not really bargaining or not really trying to come together to improve working conditions, it does really open up the door for these corrupt interests to kind of take over and run the union. So I think we need those militant activist union members to really keep things kind of on the level and make sure that the union is actually fighting for the workers' best interests.
Kelley, your thoughts on this or takeaways on other broader questions that were raised by the reading on this strike?
Yeah, absolutely. To what Rachel was just saying, this was successful because there were so many people involved. Not only was there coordination of longshoremen up and down the West Coast, but they also included the folks that they worked with, the clerks, that they worked with and other folks that sort of make those operations run. And other unions came out in support of them, either with sympathy strikes or refusing to handle the cargo that went through scabs on the port. So I think that the takeaway here is really the solidarity piece amongst all workers on the West Coast.
Rachel, you mentioned, to bring it back into the modern context, about the Chicago teachers and their current dispute. Who knows where that will be when this episode is released. Things are moving quickly on that front. But we did just see a different strike involving the Teamsters in New York City that also involved some sympathy strikes, I believe, or something close to that, as you're not really supposed to do sympathy strikes under Taft-Hartley, as we recently discussed on the show.
Right. I think trucks that were brought in to move some of the I think they were food transporters. Is that?
I think so.
I think so. So trucks that were brought in to move the product actually did refuse to move it in sympathy of the Teamsters strike. So I found that really heartening, that solidarity that was happening between the Teamsters and these truck drivers. And something else I wanted to highlight, we talked about the violence aspect of it. The police did actually come in and arrest workers on the picket line. So I think that's something that we've seen throughout history, and we continue to see to this day, that the police are anti-worker, they're strike breakers. They will come in when workers are organizing to better their working conditions. So I think that's something that we need to continually highlight, that the police are not workers' friends. And also that I did appreciate seeing the solidarity from politicians that came in. We saw AOC, Jamal Bowman, I believe, also came in, and a lot of the local politicians as well. I can't name them all. I'm not super familiar with local New York City politics. But I think that politician solidarity, you mentioned your president wants you to join a union back in the 1930s. So I think seeing these pro-union, pro-worker politicians vocally giving their support, as well as materially giving support to these strikes, is a super important thing as we saw during this recent Teamsters strike.
Yeah, it's something that I've been pondering the last several days. I'm not super familiar, as you just noted, with the details of that particular strike. And I don't think that you could necessarily replicate what FDR did, or at least how he allowed his name to be used to promote the cause of unionization. For example, if unions went around today and said, Joe Biden wants you to join a union, I don't think that would have the same effect for many, many reasons. We're in a different era than we were then. There's a different media landscape and so forth, and it's just a different economic landscape in general. But, I have definitely seen some people discussing on the left, unions in America don't need legal protections. Who cares about Taft-Hartley? Blah, blah, blah. It's only illegal action if you are unsuccessful. We don't need a favorable legal environment. American unions were strong even without legal protections. And I gotta say, after reflecting on the Toledo Autolite strike, after reflecting on this 1934 West Coast ports strike, I am not sure that is true. And we've done a lot of episodes as well on the pre-FDR era strikes in the 1920s, in the 1910s, in the 1900s, in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And I'm not sure that is really true. There's a lot of fondly remembered attempts. There were certainly some successful strikes that we've talked about in that pre FDR era, pre New Deal era, pre NERA and NRA era. Most of them were huge failures. Most of them were catastrophic failures that led to unions significantly losing what few members they had. And in many cases, many of them did not have very many members. up until the New Deal era. It wasn't just the propaganda coup, although that was obviously helpful, of saying your president wants you to join a union. The reason they were able to say that is because the acts that were passed in 1933 and 1935 were so favorable toward unionization and allowing the creation of unions and ruling out the idea that unions were a violation of the antitrust legislation on the basis that it was an illegal restraint of interstate commerce, which this, you can certainly say, they were definitely restraining interstate commerce in this particular strike. But I think that it's fair to say that the legal environment that was created, yes, you had to have willing, organizers. You had to have those radicals involved. And I think we'll probably talk a lot more about them as we progress through our episodes this year. But one of the key changes was to have that favorable legal environment. It was like night and day between 1932 and 1933, and everything before that and everything after that, we're talking about two totally different things. And Taft-Hartley did not kill the labor movement overnight, but it definitely created a slow burn, destruction sequence for the American labor movement that is continuing to this day. And I really worry when I hear people say, oh, we don't need a favorable president. We don't need a favorable government. We don't need favorable laws. We'll, just work around these laws. I simply do not think that is true. I think that the evidence from stuff like this is that it is very, very powerful to have a American federal administration that is willing to stand behind these unions and willing to support regulations and laws allowing and promoting the creation of unions. There was some consideration, allegedly, at least according to FDR, of people telling him that he needed to, because he happened to be on a U.S. Navy ship at the time in the Pacific, that they should turn around the ship and steam into San Francisco, and do basically, he didn't use these words, but the Napoleonic whiff of grape shot to scare everyone away, right? And end this insurrection, this revolt against the government and the people and the economy, etc., and purge all the communists, big show of force, dramatic military show of force. He didn't do it, right? And his labor secretary stood fast and didn't do it. Yes, there were a few members of the administration that were not very favorable toward this strike, but you could have had easily a president who took a completely different approach on this. We certainly talked about the president, not before him, but before that, Calvin Coolidge, who had been the governor of Massachusetts and vaulted to national prominence by breaking the strike against the Boston police. You could have had a president who took the completely opposite approach to this and killed it in the cradle. And instead, we had a totally different approach here, which I think helped. Yes, there were moments when the federal government tried to step in with mediation efforts that weren't particularly productive or helpful, but in the end, they got there. It's the same thing that we saw in Toledo as well. And I think it's just important to recognize that, and that, for as frustrating and dire as the electoral situation in this country is right now, which I don't dispute that it is, writing it off completely on the basis of some rose-colored version of American labor history where none of that stuff matters and has no effect, I don't think is particularly helpful. I don't like the position that labor has found itself in with regard to the Democratic Party and the Democrats basically walking all over them and not really taking them seriously. That is not what we want to see happen. But the idea that you get nothing out of electoralism and that you can do without it and that you just don't need it, I think is also probably incorrect. Not sure where we go from here on that, but I think it's worth pointing that out. Closing thoughts on this from either of you?
Something that I wanted to highlight is the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. So it's the first piece of legislation in 70 years that would kind of do away some of the parts of Taft-Hartley Act. It would outlaw right to work. It would also prevent companies from misclassifying employees as independent subcontractors. So I think, to your point about electoralism, I think if there is a good way for the federal government to ally themselves with workers and unions, it would be to pass that PRO Act. I'm not sure how many co-signers it has right now, but I think that is something now that we are controlling all three houses of the government, the House, the Senate, and the White House, that we could hopefully push this through and kind of fix some of these things. And hopefully, like the National Industrial Recovery Act, it would help prompt that kind of explosion in union membership, just because it helps create the conditions that make unionship really favorable.
Have to be honest, though, it probably ends up getting struck down in the same way that the National Industrial Recovery Act was struck down by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, not exactly a sympathetic court right now.
Yeah. Kelley?
Yeah, I would just add that I think this event in history is worth looking at, because I think that we've come to just believe that, labor is down and out and there's no way for them to get back up again. But to think about what these people accomplished for themselves, and to think about the kind of work that we could, the kind of world that we could create for our workforce, I think that's worth imagining.
All right. Well, Kelley, thank you so much for being on this week to talk about the 1934 West Coast Ports Strike.
Thanks for having me.
And Rachel, thank you for being here as well.
Thanks, Bill. Always a pleasure.